first of those is why I am here and why I think here in Guatemala you have a tremendous opportunity to use innovation and entrepreneurship to accelerate prosperity, to accelerate startups, to accelerate this ecosystem. And then the other thing I want to talk to you, which is related a little bit to, as Jorge mentioned, is what does that mean for you as entrepreneurs? How can you use the choices you make to both create and capture value and shape the companies you're building? Does that sound like an okay plan? Okay. So I'm going to start out a little bit with a little discussion of why I'm here. As many of you might know, there's this great team, right, that's part of our MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. And that program is a 2-year program, and different stakeholders from corporates, from university, from government, from entrepreneurs, from risk capital, all are coming together to try to actually advance initiatives that can really accelerate innovation-driven entrepreneurship here in Guatemala. Why do I start with this picture? This is actually the area just outside of MIT about 40 years ago. As you can see, there was almost nothing there. That's what that area looks like today. It's one of the largest transformations of urban space in the world. And the interesting thing about it was that, and here I just feel like being particularly at this school with Israel Kirzner, right, Van Mises. This was created not because the government came and said, we're going to build a big building. And it wasn't because some individual corporate, they got some multinational to just build a big factory. Instead, this entire area around Kendall Square was built by these crazy people called entrepreneurs. First, and there's only a few of us who will remember this because you guys are all young, but we're of one, was some of the first electronic spreadsheet. VisiCalc, then Lotus 1, 2, 3. What became Lotus, right? The beginnings of the biotech industry with Biogen. Akamai, that even to this day drives the global internet. And interestingly, once that process got going, and it's events like this that shaped that, that created a flywheel effect so that all the people who became entrepreneurs are now the mentors. People are networking just like what you led before. People were getting to know each other, understand, have good mentoring, learning. They saw what success looked like, what a good model was. And that's what resulted in many, many other, not just these, literally hundreds, if not thousands of successful startups coming out of that ecosystem over time. Now, interestingly, when the problem is people would come to us at MIT, right, which is a great university, and they'd say, oh, we'd like to do exactly what you did. And we said, I'm not so sure. They said, or we'd have a government would say, we'd like to build the next Silicon Valley. Well, that was not going to work either. And we said, what actually does work is when regions invest in themselves, when entrepreneurs are at the table, and when they can come together with those other stakeholders in powerful ways. And that led to both the founding of MIT REAP and a real insight that no one is in charge. No one is in charge of innovation or entrepreneurship. The government isn't. The big companies aren't. Sadly, the university isn't. Right? Universities, government, corporates, even those of you who are investors, enable entrepreneurs and innovators, right? All the good stuff you're doing. And they can block you. They can impose tariffs. Right? But they themselves are not building out the company or scaling a technology. Now, interestingly, your job, for those of you who are entrepreneurs, is to meaningfully build your companies. For those of you who are innovators, it's to develop your technology and ideas from idea to impact. And while you contribute to the ecosystem in that way, your main job is this other thing. And so there's this very curious logic of no one's in charge. And one of the things I've just been inspired by the engagement of the whole ecosystem here around REAP Guatemala, has been that cooperative spirit of seeing that flywheel effect can get started. I know events like this have been going on. It's great to see this community here, and then that keeps building and building and building and building. Everyone so far so good? All right? Essentially, we try to ask, how can we accelerate innovation and entrepreneurship? And now, interestingly, when you ask that question, part of what we do at MIT is think about ecosystems. But you could have all the meetings in the world, and you could have all the inspiring network events, except one other thing you have to do. You got to build companies. You got to innovate. And that's the other side of what I spend almost all of my time thinking about. And so over the past 15 years, actually building off a long body of work that goes back even further than that, I really started to think about how do we take what we're learning in academics from practice to build a systematic way to help entrepreneurs be really effective decision makers. So I'll just be very honest. My dad was an entrepreneur, and he put food on the table, but he was not very successful. He was less successful than he wanted to be. And I learned from that. And he didn't have mentors. Both he and his friends were all entrepreneurs, and none of them were successful. I'm being honest. And what I did observe, though, was that they were very smart and they worked really, really hard. But that very often they would take choices that they didn't really understand the consequences of because they had never thought about that choice before. They either spent huge amounts of time debating it, or they would just act without kind of thinking it through. And that really created a challenge. And so over the past 15 years, we've tried to develop, building on the just tremendous amount of things that are out there, a body of practice that you as entrepreneurs can use, that we use with investors to enable the companies they're funding, that's very focused on the most critical choices you face as a startup. And that's at the core of entrepreneurial strategy. And so just kind of at the core of that is kind of one simple logic model, is that not every idea turns into a business, but every successful business has behind it a good idea. Sometimes you'll iterate on the idea a number of times, and I know most ideas that I have are not very good. Okay? But a good idea means that you've sort of surfaced an area where you have the potential to do this incredible thing, create value for other people. We call those people customers. But guess what? Just because you have the idea, that's not worth very much. It's very important, but it's not yet worth anything. You see what I'm saying? And so you have to experiment, you have to test, you have to learn. And people talk about that. But then we need to turn those experiments, carefully designed, into choice. If all you do is spend every day experimenting exactly how you're going to kind of change the color, like the color on your website, that is probably not, okay, look at these guys, this is all they do, okay. Okay, that is probably not the one thing that's going to matter, okay? Finding a customer who absolutely loves you, and is going to reference you and give you feedback and tell their friends, that choice is much more critical. I'm going to put this into a little bit of context with an example. So this is Michael Martin and Nick Korolick. Michael was at the Harvard Business School. Everyone can make an error. That's a little joke. Okay, right? Nick was a PhD student at MIT. And they decided, this is about 10 years ago, actually 11 years ago now, they decided the problem they've identified was that emergency response. I don't know what you call, do you use 911 or what is it called? 123 here, right? That 123 didn't work on your mobile phone, okay? And what I meant by that is that if I had a heart attack right now, no one would think to I don't even know that they have a landline phone here anymore. But at that time, even though you were walking around with a supercomputer that had all your data, has video, has photos, has your location, none of that information was being transmitted when it really mattered. It was easier to call an Uber than it was to call an ambulance. Easier to get a pizza delivered. Okay? And they started to attack that problem. Nick was a PhD student in nuclear engineering and electrical, made some progress on that. Michael really got to know the customer. He took the time between his first and second year of business school, didn't go to Goldman Sachs, even though he had an offer. He turned that down. He got in his father's Prius and visited 300 different 911 centers around the United States and just listened to them. What was the problems they faced? What were they worried about? Why didn't they like adopting new technology? And that crystallized into the idea of mobile-first emergency response. Everyone so far so good? Okay. As they were developing out, this is a picture from almost 10 years ago now. You can see the graphics have gotten a little better, but that was the whole team, right? That was the entire company about 6 months after graduation. Okay? And the first thing we did, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, is the first thing we did is we spent a lot of time with them on how they would learn. So when you as an entrepreneur, what are the 2 or 3 most critical hypotheses that would either let you understand you should spend the next 5 years of your life on this, or you should do something else? So it's probably not the color of the website. Okay? Just to be clear, I love entrepreneurs, and we work with many, right? But people say, oh, I'm doing an experiment, I'm grinding it out, I'm learning. Is that helping you make better decisions? Have you written down the most critical hypothesis? Most good businesses, successful startups, have 2 or 3 core moving parts that are the things that allow them to create value and also isolate themselves from competition. And just being able to write those down meaningfully and then test them. They're hypotheses to be tested. Do you see what I'm saying? Interestingly, the second realization we had, so one is, and we're there's a lot of work on entrepreneurial experimentation and learning. The second insight, though, was that people were thinking about what you learned the wrong way. Most of the time, if you're pursuing a good idea, you're going to see multiple paths forward. It's the nature of good ideas, right? We just heard from the good, young gentleman here, right? As soon as you see, customers, a database that links, established, the 7-Eleven with the new customer need in real time, and all of a sudden we're getting some new data about that. And I didn't understand most of it because it was in Spanish, but I sort of picked that up, right? Did I get some of it, right? Once you say, how would you do that in Guatemala? We could sit here and immediately come up with 10, 15 different ways of doing that. It's not that we can't think of what to do. we can think of too many things to do. And if you're pursuing a good idea, you will see multiple paths forward. And that can be crippling. Because you say, oh my goodness, this customer over here loves me, but this other customer loves me. That shows you have a good idea. That's a reason to pursue that business. Do you see what I'm saying? But you can't do both of those things at the same time, particularly if you're this size. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? So once Michael and Nick centered on the value they could create for a mobile-first emergency response, they saw many paths forward. And we pushed them on that. And at the core of the idea of strategy for startups of this book is what we call test two, choose one. Is that you should iterate and experiment so you actually seek to surface multiple ways of moving forward. And then you choose one and leave some good paths behind, at least for the time being. And I could spend, a few hours on what I mean by that. But right? But for the time being. What I mean by that is don't try to make everyone happy. If you're pursuing something valuable, there'll be multiple paths forward, and you will literally be, and so choice is the power of leaving a good path behind. Entrepreneurial strategy is then the choice among alternative paths for an idea and the company that's built on that idea. To be clear, for some of you who are going to be, I think, in a workshop in a few days, right? You can kind of put a lot more layers onto this. What are the choices you should think about? Customer, technology and innovation, team and organization, and go-to-market and competition. If you solve those four pieces and they kind of fit together, that's a strategy. And then you can spend a lot of time on how the website looks. Okay? Does that kind of make sense, everyone? So let me show you what that means, right? How many people here have been in a class, and I'm sorry, I'm going to make a little fun here, where somebody said, find the beachhead customer, right? Everyone agrees, heard of the beachhead, right? We try to find the beachhead, right? Let me be clear, that's actually a pretty good idea. We agree with that, okay, just to be clear. And we often see this comes from Jeffrey Moore, from an old book, right? Some of us remember Crossing the Chasm. And at Crossing the Chasm, I remember, right, I got to know Jeff Moore in the 90s reasonably well. And one of the things he was doing was he was saying, oh my goodness, you got to find that early market, and then you got to figure out how to cross the chasm to get to the mainstream. That was the kind of logic. And this was based on a real theory of how the world worked, that like companies got started slowly. They needed to find some market, a market, and then they transitioned. But if you think about it, this model kind of doesn't make any sense given what I just told you. Because I said, if you're pursuing a good idea, how many beachheads are there going to be? Many. You might only be able to choose one. So that has a consequence. Rather than there being a single market S-curve, a single way this market's going to play out, your choice of beachhead shapes the mainstream that you get. Your choice of initial customer, right? Your customers have to choose you, but you're also choosing your customers. You see what I'm saying? And that's a very liberating insight. So we put these ideas together in an article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago that kind of organized some of the ideas in the book around what we call an entrepreneurial strategy compass. And the idea there is you and your ideas are in the center. There's a dimension, and I won't go too much into this, of are you more focused? There's probably one version where you're cooperating with the existing industry. Like the gentlemen who were just here, right? They were trying to help existing companies do better. You could imagine a different version of that same database being how you undermine the 7-Elevens of the world to, right, directly go to the customer. Do you see what I'm saying? Similarly, there's a separate dimension between what we call control versus execution. We're more focused on proprietary control over the ideas, IP rights, things like that, or just getting things done. Get ahead, stay ahead. So let's go back to Michael Martin. Michael and his very small team puzzled over that framework on their own time. They actually had not taken my class. And they then asked myself and a student to kind of facilitate a strategy discussion for them. But they had really invested in exploring some different options, right? They had developed a prototype technology for which it was possible to connect mobile-first emergency response. So just take it that it kind of worked technically. It didn't work that well at the time, but it worked better than whatever was out there. Okay, and they could make it work a lot better, as you'll see. And they talked to some people, and in that industry, Motorola is a huge player. They're the big established company, probably here in Guatemala. They probably have 90% of the market of the different equipment for emergency response. People said, oh, you're MIT nerds. Go license it out to Motorola. You work with them. They actually got a call from an insurance company, big life and health insurance company in the United States, that said, we will pay you $2 million today. We will write a check for you to work with us. Because we want this on our app for our customers. No one opens their insurance app being like value-added services. It's like just, right, big hassle. Do you see what I'm saying? And they were willing to pay the bills for basically a few years to implement this on their platform. They talked to other people who were more like, most people don't call emergency response that much, but if you're anti-domestic violence or American Epilepsy Association or the American Heart Association, where they think about emergencies, their communities think about emergencies all the time, they were like, oh my goodness, we love this. We have no money, but we love it. But we have really good access to people who care about this problem. Does that kind of make sense? And then finally, they went around Silicon Valley. They got some of the big VCs were like, oh, we'll write you a nice little check. There's Uber for ambulances. What we're going to do is we're going to privatize emergency response and then sell it back to the government. You might think that's a good idea or a bad idea, but it's very different than the other strategies. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? And what was interesting is they were able to develop a pretty reasonable plan for all four of those. What'd they do? They realized, though, they had actually a pretty interesting insight. I'm going to push, we're just enough. If it's okay, go 2 minutes over, okay? How long do you think it would take to get a good contract with Motorola? How long? It was a few years, right? Few years. That's a tough problem, right? Let me be clear. Michael was turning down jobs at some of the top private equity firms to go do this entrepreneurial venture. Nick Horlick was a PhD student at MIT. He could have been a faculty member at a great university. Do you see what I'm saying? And so they had to make a choice. Are they in it for the next few years? And what they realized was that this group over here, the Epilepsy Society, what they called their birding platform, those were people that if it didn't work there, it probably was never going to work. But if it did work there, they would get feedback and they would have an amplification of the work they were doing that would then allow them to do many other things in the future. Does that kind of make sense? And I remember that was actually, it's in some sense really obvious once you say it, but you have to actually then do it. Do you see what I'm saying? And what that allowed them to do was to link the choices they made to the type of firm they wanted to become. They did that. It turned out they were very successful in that early market. It did work, so they really committed the next few years. They raised a little bit of money on the side. A few years later, Tim Cook wakes up one day and he realizes that when emergency response doesn't work, people don't blame the government or 911, they blame Apple. And so he went to the National Epilepsy Association, Domestic Violence, and he said, who should we work with? And guess who they told him? They said, go talk to Michael and Nick. And their team was like 75 people. Do you see what I'm saying? And so then they were able to use that to transform the delivery of emergency response systems in the United States. They manage now more than 300 million emergency calls per year. They have only 2 metrics: financial return and lives saved. So I serve on their advisory board, so I'm a very biased towards them, but I think in a good way. And so just to kind of give you an idea, this was an ad that some of you might have seen. This is essentially driven by what they do.
911, what's your emergency?
Hi, I've been in a car accident. My car slipped. There's water getting in the car and I can't get out.
911, what is your emergency? I came out paddleboarding and a hard wind is pushing me out to sea.
Okay, do not hang up.
911, what's your emergency?
I'm here at the farm. I broke my leg. Straight down 21 feet. I sure need help quick.
Are you by yourself?
Yes.
Have you tried to get out? Have you tried to bust the window or something?
I'm pretty far out in the ocean.
I can't get to my cell phone. I'm talking on my Apple Watch.
Try to keep talking to me.
Okay.
I can't fight the wind anymore.
It's getting deeper. It's getting to my neck.
Please hurry. I'm hurting real bad.
You're going to seek help, okay?
I see them.
They're opening the door.
Hold on. Are you in an air pocket?
I'm just at the driver's seat.
Okay, but your head is above water?
Yes, sir.
Let me make very powerful, right? And it's a privilege to work with them to this day. As I said, their algorithm that they now manage, essentially every emergency call in the United States gets algorithmically routed through them, and then it presents to the local environment, and then they connect those emergency responders to the emergencies at hand, linking that in very powerful ways, and now doing all sorts of cool stuff with AI and some other things. The other thing I want to say, and I just want to bring it around, particularly as I think Monica and I are going to talk more about this, is that I think Michael would be the first to say he now has a super successful company that makes a lot of money, that's highly valued, right, and does this good stuff. But he would not have gotten there by himself. Let me be clear, the work that he and Nick and their early team did was critical, but was enabled by that ecosystem. And they were really good about taking advantage of the resources we have at MIT, the resources at Harvard, around those nonprofits, those other stakeholders. And it was those stakeholders who saw the value in what they were doing, didn't screw them over at the first possible moment, gave them good advice, sometimes tough advice, about how, to get a course correction that allowed them to go from idea to impact. So, I started out at that ecosystem level, right? What we need here, I think this is what you're building here, is you're building a community of practice, a group of stakeholders that can swim in a particular direction to actually use the power of innovation and entrepreneurship to address the most critical challenges facing Guatemala, address global challenges, and actually bring those ideas to scale in an impactful way. Thank you so much.